I think the biggest memory I have is getting up at 5:30 in the morning and putting on mascara to take my car and drive my friend Sonny Massey down to register for the draft. And I thought, if this country kills this man, I'm going to be heartbroken and really not deal with it well.
My strongest memory is taking my draft physical on the day that the television was broadcasting the pictures from the Tet Offensive, so it was late January, early February. And then coming back to campus and getting contact information for the Gene McCarthy campaign and leaving campus, and spent the rest of my senior year on a presidential campaign. But that was very much, he was a one-issue candidate out of Vietnam, and that was clearly what my sentiments were.
My memories of Vietnam was how the whole focus of the war changed during our years there. In an issue of Mac Weekly when we were sophomores in 1965, a recent grad said, "You don't have to worry about Vietnam. They have enough people that are volunteering. Don't even worry about the draft." And by the time we were seniors, there was no exemption for grad school. There were, 45,000 people killed in 1968. So the chronicle of it is, and the participation of the students at MAC just changed over that short period of time.
I just remember people, especially men, making plans. I mean, so many people were trying to get into the reserves. So many were trying to join the Navy. They were going in for 3 years. I was an education major, so I thought, I kind of stood back. I thought, this isn't going to affect me. But it ultimately did. I lost my deferment and was drafted. But a lot of people's lives changed, and it probably increased the rate of marriages or separations, as far as that happens normally at the end of our college years, but I think it was heightened with maybe your husband was going to go to war.
I was a bit oblivious to what was going on until I was planning on getting married that fall. And all of a sudden, again, like Dick said, the plans are what your life is going to be deferred, and my husband did end up going into the service. But till it affected me personally, I wasn't particularly involved. And then once it affected me personally, it's amazing how you tune in, you educate yourself on what's going on.
There were a lot of students who, by 68, we had this silent witness thing once a week, right at the lunch break, where we would line up outside the old student union down Grand Avenue and just stand. We didn't have signs and we didn't yell anything. It was just a silent protest against what was going on.
Parallel to that vigil, earlier in the fall of '67, there was a vigil on Wednesdays for Peace Through Victory. They didn't make it through Christmas. So there was a national survey of college students in April of 1968 about the war. And kind of amazingly, 10% of the response wanted us to add more troops and bomb more. So, I mean, the overwhelming was 66% against, but there was a small group that believed you could win through. So,
And the sense I had on campus when I came, after each primary, I would come back and get my assignments for the next few weeks from professors and then leave again, and I was able to take tests by mail. But the sense I got on the campus, I don't know if you guys had the same sense, was that we were really leading, the students were much more in advance of these tumultuous issues than the administration, which was, I mean, how could any college administration really be prepared for the tumult that all of a sudden, was the river we were all swimming in. So it was, I definitely got the sense that, I was able to graduate and take tests by mail and do things that were pretty unorthodox. But that was because partly I guess I was able to be convincing that I should be entitled to it. But I don't think there were too many in the faculty that really wanted to push back on much of that. Like you're talking about the vigils and things. I mean, they were really looking at us, the student body, which was kind of coalescing in a much more active mode than probably any of us expected to be in college.
And as a follow-up, in the spring, April of '68, Dean Kramer, in the Mac Week, every issue of the Mac Weekly had something by one of the administration people. And Dean Kramer was concerned that the students would be adversely impacted by what was going to happen in the politics and politically. And he felt that the administration, faculty were letting down the students. They were not showing the proper leadership. It was rather poignant because it seems we have similar situations now, so.
Although I don't remember huge numbers, because remember, this campus, by and large, our president was very conservative. Parents may have been politically liberal, but as far as behaviors, it was still follow the law. You know,
Right.
if you got in trouble at school, you were in bigger trouble at home. I think that's how we were raised, and that has changed. But you know, there weren't hundreds lined up on Grand, there were tens. And so I think Linda had the great point. Until it affected you personally, I mean, I noticed it, but we were worried about, you know, where our love life might be heading at graduation, worried about the draft. But many of us, I don't think, were ever raised the idea that we would, at this point, do unorthodox or unlawful protest or whatever. It wasn't in our DNA yet. It started to build later. I was a bit aloof because I just felt I was going to get a deferment. I was going to be a teacher.
Yeah,
They didn't.
When the
They didn't
selective
grant
service
teachers.
at the end of 1967 changed, that there would be no deferments for grad school, including law school. The only deferment for grad school was medical. And then, you know, because this was just a few months before we graduated, and then everybody's life was more directly impacted than perhaps one had thought.
And I feel, and I agree with you, it was sort of our backgrounds. And when we grew up, the biggest thing you did to protest was write a letter to the newspaper and let them know what your opinion was. And that was about your way of expressing your discomfort or your unhappiness. And so this new thing, and as I say, I was a little more oblivious, and to me it wasn't a huge movement until, and then when the convention in Chicago in the summer was, I think, a wake-up call for me that this is a whole different animal than I was aware of when I was here.
Yeah, when I left in February to join the presidential campaign, I was obviously amongst people that were like-minded, and so I didn't sense on the campus whether it was a lot of hundreds or tens, but there was definitely a shift, and whether it was through silent or more understated ways of expressing a point of view, it was clearly a shift, and there was clearly a shift in the administration wondering what to do, because I proposed all sorts of things to graduate and take tests and be exempted from things, and these are just my proposals. And it was political science and English, and they all said okay. I mean, that was a degree of cooperation that I think reflected the broader concern of the administration. What do we do with this? It's a new era.
I have a picture of myself at graduation, and I don't know, I think it was a fair amount of the graduates did this, but I was wearing a black armband on my graduation robe, which if I remember correctly, was to protest the bombing of Cambodia, which had started about that time. And I don't know, does anybody else remember doing that?
I think I remember Mary Gephardt saying her parents were disappointed that some graduates were wearing armbands, and I think she did. And so even that, and you know, they were educators, probably pretty liberal, but again, just that at these solemn occasions like graduation, you didn't make waves. That was for another time or another place.
Well, and that's interesting to me because obviously I was there, I was near you, and I was not aware till this moment that happened. And so whatever people were thinking, I wasn't aware, and I was in their part of the group.
So 1968, our class was like the advent of the more and more confrontational reactions. Kent State was the explosion 2 years later.
It shut this campus down.
Yeah.
My brother graduated from Northwestern thanks to Kent State. The schools just graduated everybody out.
Yeah, it was, I think to a certain degree, Macalester was buffered a little bit because I didn't see it because where I was in Los Angeles when JFK or RFK was assassinated. And from that perspective, the whole world was coming apart.
You bet. Right.
Because what I saw on the TV was not only, I went to bed that night. There were initial medical reports saying that he was not that badly wounded. It wasn't fatal. I remember that very distinctly. Waking up the next morning, I went to the campaign headquarters, and all of a sudden we got the news. But I remember everybody was running around, not just talking about that, but the students in Paris had just taken over the Paris city government or some government.
Oh, man.
And there was this distinct, from that perspective in Los Angeles on June 6th, 1968, there was a perspective of things coming apart and the center was not holding. But I mean, I agree. I came back to Macalester later that summer before I went to the convention in Chicago, and things, of course it was summer, things seemed quieted. Then I go to Chicago and it's absolutely coming apart again.
Yeah.
So I was sort of, I didn't go to graduation, so I wasn't there, but I was a little bit between maybe two worlds.
I think part of this too, it wasn't just Vietnam. There was a huge amount of things going on in the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. There was a huge march all the way down Summit to the state capitol when that happened. We had a bunch of kids from Mac that went to the Second Selma March. So things were happening. Vietnam was a big part, but it wasn't the only thing that was really in flux on campus.
And I think, too, we may have been a bit predisposed because of our college education. I think in high school we just learned about these things, and America was always right. And I was a history major, and we started to learn in college that America wasn't always on the right side of issues, and we started to accept the fact that sometimes it was might made right instead of we were always this shiny beacon on the hill. I just remember one quote, I wish I had said it, but they said Vietnam was the first war where I think our generation decided that you could love America, but you didn't have to love its wars. And I thought, what a great quote, and I think that Vietnam started that era of solid questioning. What are we doing in these places in the world?